And what I was last talking about was, you know, how often are kids tortured and even killed, and if it's out of sight, out of mind, we don't really think about it. Especially when it's happening in another country, just think it's not that, it must happen all the time. People have things to do, they can't always dwell on everything. And yet this was happening to my son in the United States by people who are employed by the United States. And whenever there is a missing child, it seems like there's a lot of media coverage for that. Whenever there is evidence of torture of a child, it seems like the media would be all over that. CPS, negligence, you know, child abuse that goes undetected and leads to harm. Typically the media is interested in covering something like that. So whatever groups have been responsible for doing this to my son Oliver have also been responsible for controlling the media. Because my son has not had any coverage that I'm aware of that would have protected his rights, his life, and his dignity. So after, when my son's face was cut up, side of his cheek cut out, I was staying with this man who had connections to Canada. And his former very serious girlfriend of 2.5 years was living in Canada still. I remember that on the day that that happened to my son, he had all these pocket knives laying out. And I wasn't exactly sure what kind of a point he was trying to make. Then, and then as I say, I was looking at this, the first time that I went onto this royalty site was while I was staying with him. And I found out that my internet was being connected through his internet, but allowing other people to see what I was doing. And it wasn't just his internet or computer. I mean, there were other individuals who were monitoring all of my online activities. But for whatever reason, somebody who had access to my son, which pretty much looks like Anne Crane or somebody from CPS themselves, poured permanent solution down my son's throat. Hair perm. For, you know, and hair permanent solution is used for curling hair. So it was almost like they tortured my son because I looked up an article about some woman who had red curly hair connected to a psychic who was saying that that's who William was going to be with. I mean, what kind of whacked person is that? I mean, what else, what was the alternate symbolism for specifically choosing hair permanent solution, which is used for curling hair? I'm trying to think of any other alternative message that somebody was trying to send to me. And they're really, at least in my frame of reference, and with my experience in the world at that time, perm solution equals curly hair equals I went to a UK royalty site and read something about William of Wales and a curly red-haired woman. that was the only reference to curly hair within my entire, in the last, I mean, couple of months or so, and it wasn't like I was obsessed with looking things up about the royal family. I went to that site, to that website, for the first time when I stayed with this person who was connected to Canada, who had a girlfriend from Canada. And I only looked up a couple of articles, and I signed into it, as I say, because I was looking up something about Diana specifically. But there was no other... after that point, I mean, that was pretty much, because I did not go to that site, I can remember which articles I happened to come across, because there weren't that many. I didn't spend a lot of time on that site. I spent maybe a total of, I don't know, maybe half an hour of my entire life. I mean, I haven't looked at that site again for a very long time. I mean, potentially. And then I remember around that time, I was at a different chat room. I was in a chat room with somebody who said that they were from Australia. Like some people from Perth, Australia. But at any rate, somebody was pouring hair permanent solution for curling hair down my son Oliver's throat. And the Wenatchee CPS was in on it, and most likely getting some kind of a reward for it, for concealing crimes against children. And I can't imagine who would do that kind of a thing. The other thing that happened to my son was, and actually it was after that was done to my son, and I wrote about it on my blog. Then there was a woman who went missing from a hair place. She was like a hairstylist in town. And she went missing, or actually she was found killed. And she had worked at a beauty salon. And I remember feeling like the police were kind of, well, not really looking at me, but I remember there was sort of a weird thing where I thought somebody was trying to make some kind of a connection, like, did I know anybody or was there a connection between my talking about my son being poisoned and tortured with this woman who worked at a hair salon? And I mean, I never thought that it was some woman at a hair salon. And the only thing that people do at hair salons, they do hair, which would include like perm solution, that kind of thing, and makeup and nails. But I never made any kind of connection like that, and nobody that I was around would have done that either. Like, the most glaring connection was through the kinds of people that worked for the federal government and the state government that had access to my son. Those are the only people that would have been able to possibly do this to my child. Who would have been interested in also concealing it. There's no way they couldn't smell that on my son either. Then one of the last things that I noticed had happened to my son, I also saw that he was being coached to do certain things. He was basically being programmed, like brainwashed and programmed. They were doing a lot of things with my son, and I started to suspect that, even though I hadn't even gotten very, like, totally firm confirmation that that's what they were doing with me. At least that's the excuse they were making for ruining my life. And, I had not yet found myself in an actual federal detention facility where they were using me for research, and I could say, aha, without a doubt I can say that it is the federal government. So that hadn't happened to me yet. But already I had an idea that obviously things were happening with the state. I was still holding out, thinking, well, maybe the federal government's better. Somehow thinking that possibly they're not involved. They were involved. And the next thing that I saw that happened to my son Oliver, where I could say without any doubt this is beyond the scope of even quote-unquote child abuse, was that my son was trying to show me how to hypnotize him. And no child of age 3 knows how to tell an adult how to hypnotize them unless they've had somebody specifically trying to hypnotize them. And when I saw evidence that my son had been exposed to hypnosis, when I said that out loud with Anne Crane there, I said, my son is being... I am very tired of having somebody mess around with my video camera too. It's basically going blurry and then not going blurry, and I can see all of it, and I'm tired of that. It doesn't have anything to do with my technology or the way that that camera works specifically. And as I was saying, the only group that would be interested in when I saw that my son was being hypnotized and that he knew something about hypnotism, I said something out loud while Anne Crane was there. And I said, my son is being hypnotized. I said, you see this? He said, he's showing me how to hypnotize him. And after that, the state, they had already been trying to cut back on all of my visits. They had been punishing me by canceling visits. They said my son was sick. They said this came up, that came up, and so they were basically, I had court-ordered visits, but I only got about half of the court-ordered visits because they didn't make all of them up. They didn't make them up. They're supposed to do a makeup visit if you miss them or there's something that comes up. They didn't do that. They did some makeup visits for a few of them, to just put it on the record to make it look like they did do makeup visits. But for most of them, they didn't. So they were already trying to break my son's bond with me and cut off our communications completely. And right about that time is when my son was talking more, and they didn't like that, I don't think, because I was getting more information from him. Even though they were torturing him into silence and punishing him if he did say too much to me. And when I saw that they were using him for hypnosis and that he knew what hypnosis was, I said something to Anne Crane, and that was pretty much one of the very last visits I ever had with my son. The state at that point decided to discontinue the visits because it was getting a little risky for them. My son, basically they had different toys that I could tell were being used outside of the visitation center with my child by somebody. So I don't know if he was getting quote-unquote counseling from someone and I wasn't being told about it because they didn't tell me a lot of things, or if he was visiting with someone in a state office after I had to leave and then while he was waiting to be picked up by the Avila's. I'm not sure where this kind of thing was occurring with my son, but somebody was using toys that were in those visitation rooms outside of the visitation room with my child because he was showing me different things about the toys that indicated someone else had used them around him. And specifically for this hypnosis thing, there were these 3 horses. It was like My Little Pony horses, figurines. There were all kinds of different animals and farm things in the room. But somebody specifically was taking one of the My Little Pony horses, and they were, and my parents, my mom and dad, are totally against hypnosis. When they found out one time that I was dating a man, a psychologist, actually he was a psychiatrist, and I went out on a date or two with him. When they found out that I'd gone on a couple dates with him and he was talking about hypnosis, they said, get away. As quickly as you can. And I don't approve of hypnosis, and it's especially not hypnosis of children. And while all of these other forms of torture against my son looked like mafia work or